Hello everyone, and welcome to the end of Season 3 of Hames Hot Mic, sponsored by Simpson Notaries. Seems inconceivable to me that we've done 3 series of interviews and been a part of 3 different elections. I've had a chance to interview mayors, councillors, board chairs, MPs, MLAs, and lots of people who are stirring the pot in our communities. Today's episode will be somewhat unique, as my guest and I will review together the actions and impacts of all of these folks and more. After this short break, I'll be back with my guest, Paul Henderson, the editor of the Chilliwack Progress newspaper. I'm very excited about today's guest because normally I sit and ask questions of politicians or pot stirrers in the community, and today I get to do some analysis of our political scene with the editor of BC's oldest community newspaper. Paul Henderson's LinkedIn suggests that he started working the Chilliwack Times in 2006. It seems like he's been around forever. I couldn't believe that number. But Paul graduated from Western University with a degree in philosophy and then went on to complete studies in journalism at one of Canada's premier journalism programs at Langara. He finished that program in 2006, and he's been working as a journalist ever since. Paul began working for the Progress when the 2 papers, the Chilliwack Times and the Chilliwack Progress, merged a few years ago, and is now the editor, as I said, of BC's oldest community newspaper. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks very much.
Listen, Chilliwack Progress, as I say, is the longest running newspaper in BC and has a very storied history. The newspaper's been writing about the life and times of this community since 1891. That's part of 3 centuries, and the first owner of the paper, W.T. Jackman, I remember names like Les Barber and Cease Hacker, and publishers like Brian McChrystal, Lloyd Mackey, and Jim Robertson as editors. These were all people that were household names in our communities when they were working with the paper. What does it feel like to have that additional weight on top of you, including the job you have to do? Do you think about that sense of history that community newspaper comes with?
Well, you know, in a day-to-day job, it's like a grind. It's like you're in the salt mines and you just keep your head down and you don't think about it. But there are times when you reflect. Every once in a while, the paper comes out and you flop it open and you see how does it look, and you go, yeah, I'm the editor of the Chilliwack Progress. That's pretty cool. But mostly over the years, it wasn't, or I've only been the editor for 2 years now, a year and a half. But when we did our 130th edition, it really struck home because I decided instead of rehashing some of the stories, the big stories over the years, I would contact some of those old editors. Obviously, in 130 years, not too many of them are alive, or I wouldn't know where they are if they were. But I did get, I got Andrew Franklin, who was not an editor, but and I got Andy Halota, and I got Lloyd Mackey. I tracked down Lloyd Mackey and got him to write something, and he was the editor, I guess, in the 80s. I think he was in there in the 70s maybe too.
Yes.
So yeah, so that suddenly having these editors email me copy and ask if it's okay. Do you think this is going to work? And whereas I'm the editor, did give me a little bit of perspective. And then when you start looking at our archives, we've got an incredible newspaper archives on our website. The Chilliwack Museum and Archives has all the copies of the Progress, literally back to 1891, scanned and searchable on our website from 1891 to 2007. And so, in that sense, you get a sense of just the history of journalism. Actually, it's really neat to look back at that and then think, I don't even know how many editors there've been since then. It would take me forever to figure it out. But it's a storied newspaper for sure, and it's great to be part of it.
And it must be, I know that newspapers have newspaper conventions, and there are award ceremonies that you go to frequently. I think Ma Murray Awards are ones that I know the most about. It must be a nice feeling to be able to walk in and have the Chilliwack Progress badge on there. You're the granddaddy of all the papers. So
yeah, I'm not sure how many people know that, but I assume all the publishers do, and the more experienced people. I count myself not just a relative newcomer, but a real newcomer to town. 15 years is nothing in newspapers, and I've been in Chilliwack since 2006. You mentioned my journalism education. That was actually 2000 I was done that. But
Oh, I'm sorry, I got it wrong.
that's okay. I worked in, my first job was actually as a reporter at the Grand Forks Gazette, and where I worked under the editor who was Mike Schwinnard,
Oh,
who
yeah.
was from Chilliwack,
Yeah.
and he was a reporter at the Chilliwack Times. And when he left Chilliwack, I got his job.
And that's right. Yeah,
So
Mike
there
was.
exchange there.
I was saying to somebody just the other day in sort of doing a little research on this interview. First of all, you're right. The newspaper has an incredible archive, and I use it all the time just to refresh my memory about things. But in research for this show, or just research about some of the things I'm involved with in the community, it is a great, great archive. I encourage people to have a look at it.
Mm-hmm.
But what I was saying was that in the olden days, and you're a relative newcomer at 15 years, and I've been here about 60. There were always 4 people in the community that everybody knew who they were. One was our base commander when we had a base. One was the administrator of the local hospital. One was the mayor, and one was the editor of the Chilliwack Progress. Everybody in town knew who those people were. Right. And so much of that has changed. I think about the fact that we don't have a base anymore, that we don't have sort of local management of our health system anymore. Mm-hmm. We still have a mayor, and most people know who that is, and we have an editor of the Progress. How much has things changed? Even in the time that you've been here in the 15 years, how much has the media business changed, and what are the drivers of that change?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the last 15 years, I think the change has been probably exponential compared to even the 15 years before that. When I arrived at the Chilliwack Times in 2006, we were publishing a print edition of the paper twice a day. The Progress was publishing twice a week, sorry. And the Progress was publishing twice a week, and I think 3 times a week at a certain point. They were doing a weekend edition even. And it was all about that print product, and the we would have 48, 52-page papers. The Progress would have 64-page plus papers all the time, and it was all about that print product. And then we had a website, and it was like, oh yeah, we have a website. And when you go to press with the paper, we would actually email our stories off to some technical person who we didn't know really who it was. And they would put our stories on our website, and then we would carry on with the next print edition. Obviously, the internet changed everything. Yep. And the internet's been around for a lot longer than 15 years, but people don't remember that, even Facebook, which is arguably changed the world and for the better, for the worse, depending on who you talk to. Facebook wasn't around in 2006. It didn't exist, right? Yep. So suddenly everything changed, and newspapers were really slow to react. We were slow. Newspapers, even up to the New York Times, they were very slow to learn how to monetize the internet, whereas the social media giants, took over. Newspapers were slow and lumbering and focused on that print edition, and community newspapers especially so, because that's what people wanted. They want that paper on their doorstep, a lot of the people. But we had to adapt, and we had to move, and those social media giants are part of what pushed us into making sure our web presence was better and better and better, and then we utilized those social media products to put forth our product. When it first started, I remember thinking my metaphor was like posting our story on Facebook. I said that's like standing in a Canadian Tire with a Home Hardware sign. Like, why would I do that? Like, but of course that's a means to get your story out to a wider market. And now the Progress is a master at getting those stories out. You're always on Facebook with stories that are fairly immediate. It's a way to get those stories to people quite quickly. And the newspaper is really a summation of what you've provided online to folks over the course of that week. Yeah, and so our website, because we actually are more and more, we were always just like, with the Chilliwack Progress, there's the Abbotsford News, there's the Surrey Now Leader, Langley, Time Victoria News. Black Press has 163 newspapers in BC, Alberta, Washington, Hawaii. We're not connected necessarily with the American products or even Alberta, But our BC products are very connected now, and we have a digital team and we, like, every morning at 9:30 a.m. I have a meeting with every editor in the Lower Mainland to talk about what do you guys got for today that's worth sharing to the other sites as well. Sometimes you don't have much because you're covering city council or you're covering like a local, the chiefs or arts things. But quite often we have really interesting stories, and then we share those stories with each other, and then we share them on social media. And when it comes to the print product, yeah, I just have to pick through the best of what we've done that week. And not always the best of what we've done that week, but the stuff that most suitable for print, because sometimes I think to an older demographic in print. I don't know that's always totally accurate, but if there's a story that the seniors should see, and it's not exactly something that did well in traffic on our website, they still need to see it in print, maybe.
It forces you to think in a whole different way about when and how stories are presented. You mentioned Facebook not even being around in 2006, and I count myself as completely lucky that I got out of politics in 2008, just as Facebook and social media was exploding. I'm not sure I'd know how to deal with that in today's reality, but it's a reality for politicians, and it's a reality for the news media. Quite frankly.
No, and what your predecessor, but sorry, coming after you, Sharon Gates, Mayor Sharon Gates, who was very, very confident and active and vocal and a really well-liked mayor. She was treated so terribly on social media. I mean, I get treated terribly on social media, and I don't care because I've come to not care anymore. But she was treated so badly on Twitter and Facebook, and I think all politicians are. Most politicians these days maybe are more used to it, but it was a kind of early days, and she was just. I think she fled at least Twitter, and I don't know about Facebook. I'm not sure. I don't know, but I mean the way they're treated is just not good, and you wouldn't have liked it.
I think what happened is that if you engage. You're treated very poorly. There are many politicians who are successful on social media because they don't engage. They put their stories out there, but they don't take comments on them, and they don't respond on social media. And that's maybe the lesson that has to be learned by politicians on social media.
And reporters and editors. Believe me, I spent too much time responding, and I realized it never. Sometimes you can engage people and have good conversations, but there's the nature of the platform is that people are just way more aggressive than they would be in your face, and then you get way more defensive than you should, and then it usually ends badly. And so I've learned the hard way actually quite a lot. I've had campaigns of anger against me for various reasons.
I follow you on social media, and so I chuckle at times at how easy it is to get down that rabbit hole in certain areas. So I admire the fact that you have to maintain a presence on social media, because that's now part of the new world for a newspaper editor. Let's talk about politics now, because I'm really interested in hearing some of your impressions on where the community is headed politically. We've just had in our community, Chilliwack and Chilliwack Kent, I think it's called, 2 NDP members elected to the BC legislature in the last election. And progressives were understandably in the community quite delighted. But we've just come through a federal election where, despite the usual talk that the riding is changing and we're getting younger and we're moving farther to the left, nothing really changed federally. Do you think things are really changing, or the provincial election was more an anomaly that was influenced by COVID and vote splitting?
Yeah, I think it is changing, but just the sort of metaphor that just popped into my head is that it's not an avalanche, it's a glacier, and people think, oh, it's changing. We have 2 NDP MLAs. Some of the metrics behind that, arguably, I'm not a political scientist, but some of the metrics behind that are interesting, and I can throw out a couple numbers there if it helps. Whereas with the federal and the federal numbers, same thing. There's some interesting metrics there, but things don't happen overnight. They happen sort of slowly, and And speaking to, let's just say, if you don't mind, I'll just, speaking to the provincial election, where Dan Coulter won in Chilliwack, and he won over, BC Liberal incumbent John Martin. In that riding, people always hate to talk about vote splitting, but in some cases it's a reality.
Yeah.
Well, Diane Jansen, former city councillor, who obviously you know well, was wanted to be the BC Liberal candidate, and they didn't hold a meeting to decide that. They just gave it to John. So she ran for the BC Conservatives. So BC Conservatives are an insignificant party, frankly, in BC. They've never had I don't think they've ever had an MLA. And, Dan Coulter won the riding with 42% of the vote. And John Martin got 28% of the vote. And Diane Jansen got 16% of the vote. You can't always just add those numbers together, but if you did,
Yeah.
you get 44% of the vote. So it would have been like a dead heat between the BC Liberal candidate if the BC Conservative didn't exist. And in the other riding in Chilliwack, Kent, you got incumbent Laurie Thronis against Kelly Patton. And Kelly won with 36% of the vote, and Laurie got 31% of the vote. Well, a few weeks before that vote, Laurie was basically booted out of the BC Liberal caucus.
Yeah.
So he ran as an independent, and while there was a lot of people that would have been loyal to Mr. Thronis, there's a lot of more people who are loyal to the party, not to mention all the people who just go to the ballot box and they don't even know who these people are, but they just don't want the NDP or they don't want the BC Liberals, and they pick the other one. And so when there was no BC Liberal candidate in Chilliwack Kent, I'm sure people, so that could have affected it. So that could have helped the NDP win that riding.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in that particular riding, a lot of BC Liberals that I've spoken to said, well, we had to park our votes somewhere. We weren't gonna vote for the NDP, and we weren't gonna vote for Laurie Thronis because he'd been somewhat discredited by the party. Mm-hmm. So I feel like a lot of votes got parked with other places, maybe the Green, and certainly with Jason Lum. So.
Right, Jason Lum, of course, was the other very popular individual. Yeah.
I think that vote splitting had something to do with that. I think in the case of Dan Coulter, though, that getting just over 40% of the vote, that was one of the best races run by the NDP in a long, long time. I'm not even sure I know of anyone that got more than that, except I think maybe once in a by-election when there was other vote splitting, ironically, between John Martin, who ran as a Conservative, right, and Laurie Thronis, who ran as a Liberal. So, but that 42% was pretty impressive to me. Yeah. But I think it has a lot to do with the fact Dan's profile is very high, a very highly regarded individual in the community. So I think there's some glacial movement, as you called it there.
For sure. As the chair of the school board, and unfortunately things are getting a little more divisive in a couple different ways. And the school board is maybe the worst example of that. But as the chair of the school board and the so-called progressive group, Dan was very well known, and he did a good job of chairing those meetings, and so I think he had a high profile for sure. Yeah,
I think he garnered a lot of respect through that process. Paul, we're just going to take a quick break, and I'm going to be back and ask you some questions about some things local and some things perhaps federal as well. So we'll be right back after this message. Welcome back to this segment of Hames Hot Mic. My guest is Paul Henderson, the editor of the Chilliwack Progress newspaper. Paul, before we took a break, we were talking about politics, and I want to continue that, and I would like to talk a little bit about local politics. Local government scene has been, in my mind, pretty quiet over the last little while. There hasn't been a lot of things happening at the school board. Now that part of that is they're coming out of summer break. But there's really nothing going on at City Hall as well. No big issues that seem to be emerging. We've got an election for both of those coming up in 2022. I'm wondering what you think are going to be the issues as we move forward into election season, which you will start probably early in the new year.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to know what the issues will be specifically. We often have like a large field of people running for city council, and then who runs for mayor it makes it. That's what people pay most attention to. So it'll be interesting if somebody steps up to run for mayor, but who knows? But one of the things that I think is very important at a municipal level and should be an issue is just housing, and that ranges all the way from homelessness to zoning to rezoning to land use. And some of the stuff that the city has done in the last few years has actually been quite remarkable. Whether that can be credited to the current administration or even the past one is hard to say exactly, but the most obvious example would be Five Corners, District 1881, which is just, I mean, it's hard to be, it shouldn't be gushing, I should be a little more objective, but it's just quite amazing what they finally did down there. Yep. That was dreamed up back in your day, of course, something like that. And I was always like, yeah, dude, who's going to do that? And it's happening, and that's great. But housing is really, really critical, and Chilliwack is a very large, geographically large city. But of course, 67% of the land base, as you well know, is in the agricultural land reserve. And so it's untouchable. I mean, you can't even, I've seen people try and get a granny flat built on ALR land, and they get rejected. It's very strict in that way. So there's really only, there's no green space to build on. There's no green lands to build on. So there's really only density or the hillsides. And hillside development is very, very expensive. It's still happening, but it's usually luxury homes at this point. Promontory might be an exception to that, but it's creeping so high up on Promontory there. And then it's density, and a lot of people obviously get faced with sort of NIMBYism or whatever you want to call it with density. But density is what this city needs. Every city planner in the world will tell you that. Chilliwack is not a Vancouver or a Toronto or even a Surrey. It's relatively small population, under 100,000, but there's more and more people moving here all the time. There's more and more. There's just so many people coming here, and it is. I used to call it the last bastion of affordability in the Lower Mainland. The average home price last month was $750,000. Average single-family home price was over $900,000. So the word affordability for Chilliwack is even kind of going out the door. But I mean, it's going to have to be addressed. There may have to be complete policy changes to focus on density. There's current rules where in neighborhoods in Chilliwack, for instance, where if one owner on a street wants to subdivide to create a duplex, and I'm not exactly sure on how these rules work. Once they've done that, no one else on that block, both sides of the street, is allowed to do it. Only one per block, and so things like that are probably gonna have to change, and I'm not sure if that will be anything that anybody can run a campaign on or get excited about. A lot of municipal politics is about wastewater and and otherwise boring things. Voter turnout is low, but we'll see. That could be a topic. As for school board, the same thing applies. I watched the school board meeting last night. Everyone's very excited about on Tuesday night. Everyone's very excited about the new school, Imagine High, that opened up. Stitos Slalom Tilt is under construction down by the river. That's great. And then the superintendent went through enrollment numbers for this year. And enrollment this year is up 423 students. That's an entire school.
Yeah.
So they cannot, and they admitted, some of the senior staff admitted, and some of the trustees were talking about it. They're having a hard time keeping up, and they're going to have a hard time keeping up with school expansions and with just more people coming here.
And I think this is a period of time when we're seeing a lot of schools being built in Chilliwack, and it's still not keeping up. I mean, I can remember days when, Promontory Elementary was the first new school that had been built in the district for a long, long time. And now we're seeing, new schools announced and expansions announced, and we're still not keeping up with that. You raised such an interesting point about local governments and density and zoning. And there's a school of thought that's now emerging from think tanks that deal with those kinds of issues, saying perhaps it's time to take that issue out of local government hands, because there's just so much pressure on a local government from neighborhoods to not do things that perhaps we really need to be looking at those kinds of density issues more from a provincial level, much like the ALR has done on a provincial level, that we need to focus on maybe taking that out of the hands of local government. What do you think of that idea?
Well, it's not a bad idea. You would certainly alienate a lot of people, and you would alienate those people who run locally, who want to have a hand in that. And the comparison I would make is again to school board. We've had a lot of drama at the school board over the last few years over things like SOGI 123, but elected school trustees don't really have much power. They, they're sort of gatekeepers, they're policy makers, and they're caretakers. They have a well over $100 million budget, and they get to niggle in the margins at the very, very most. The running joke we used to make, almost like a hashtag, was during the worst of the controversy conflicts was make school board meetings boring again, because they used to be staggeringly boring because they don't have any power to do anything. If that transferred over to city council, where suddenly city council didn't even have the power to decide on, I don't know how that would look if they didn't have the power to make an OCP or design on zoning for certain neighborhoods because, let's say, the provincial government decided that anything within a certain area of municipalities could be free-for-all. You could build apartment buildings. I don't know how that would look.
Yeah, I think somewhere in between those things,
Sure.
you mentioned OCPs, and I've always been a fan that once an OCP is adopted, that it shouldn't, and the community's had input into that.
Right.
Why do you need a further rezoning process if the official community plan says this neighborhood should accept an amount of density? Why does the council then have to go to that neighborhood and get permission again? Well, not necessarily permission, but hold public hearings in that neighborhood if it's already been determined that that's the highest and best use for that neighborhood. So I've always questioned that, but I wasn't brave enough as mayor to say we shouldn't have these public hearings because they're very people hold those very dear to their hearts.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about federal politics, if we can. We just had a federal election. Was the outcome federally a surprise to you, and was the outcome locally a surprise?
The outcome federally was no surprise to me. I mean, if I'm fair, I literally wrote down on a sticky note what percentage of votes I thought the local candidates would get. Federally, I was sure this would just continue. I was almost positive it would be what did happen. Not saying that maybe I got lucky with that guess, but there did not seem to be enough movement towards Aaron O'Toole, and everyone always talks about. All the polls talked about, voter intention and who people liked, which party people were leaning towards. But none of that means anything because every riding in our system is its own entity. So if a few more conservatives in a Liberal riding voted for them, okay, the Liberals still won, and vice versa in many other areas. Locally, I predicted, to be honest, I predicted Mark Straw would win his seat back. He would be reelected with slightly lower number that he won. I think I wrote on my little piece of sticky note that he would get 40% of the vote. He got 46% of the vote, and I guessed that DJ Poll for the NDP would get 28% of the vote, and she got 27% of the vote. And I forget where else I went wrong, but clearly I gave too much credit to the Liberals and Kelly Valonis because she got a lot less than I guessed, and Mark Straw got a lot more. So it didn't really surprise me, that outcome. But as I said, these changes happen slowly. If there's a change in the demographics of our city, it's not necessarily going to happen overnight. You can't just look at the real estate market and say everyone's moving here from the city more and more. If you ask any real estate agents anecdotally, a lot of the buyers of our very hot market are from outside the region. That doesn't mean they're necessarily progressive voters.
That
doesn't mean it's enough of a number of people that's going to change the demographics overnight.
Yeah, I would guess if you looked at it, the same number of, if you looked at the Fraser Valley and Metro Vancouver as one unit, the same number of people moving here the percentage of progressives and
It might be similar, yeah.
Conservatives would probably be the same. So we can't always assume, and I don't think you can assume that younger people are predisposed to being progressive. I mean, my dad used to say, if you're not voting for the NDP when you're 20, you got no heart, and if you're not voting for conservatives when you're 50, you got no head. He sort of likened that there was some sort of creeping conservatism that happened with folks, that they tended to be more progressive as they were younger and more conservative as they were older. I don't necessarily think that's so, but I think there is a thought that most young people are progressive and older folks are conservative. I don't think that holds true.
You reminded me of one time, former councillor Chuck Stam said something like that to me, where he made an accusation of being too progressive or too left, and he said, "Don't worry, when you get older, you'll vote conservative." I don't know what I vote now. I don't even know what I vote now, but okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's true. But the one thing with just the numbers, the brief numbers that I looked at, just I think again to touch on this sort of glacial pace of change. And I'm not saying it's better or worse to go one way or the other, but if the city is slightly getting a little bit more progressive, we've had a very conservative history here in Chilliwack for a very long time. But I looked at the numbers just quickly before I came here, and Mark got 46% of the vote this time. And if you compare the last three elections together, so 2019, 2015, and 2021, Mark Strahl had an average of 46% of the vote. And that's a lot, and that's going to win you a seat in any riding in Canada. The three elections before that in Chilliwack, whether it was Chilliwack Fraser Canyon or Chilliwack Hope, one was Mark Strahl, and two of those three were his father, Chuck. They had an average of 58% of the vote.
Yeah.
So, from 2006 to now, you had 58% of the vote winning the riding to 46% of the vote. 12% is a lot.
Yes.
It's still way more than you need to win, but there's some sort of a change happening there, whether it's incremental or how quickly it will change, or if it'll just settle at that sort of range. Who knows? But there is some change in the water for sure.
And we throw everything out these last couple of years because there's been such an influence of COVID. I've said to several of the candidates, it doesn't seem like anybody cares about running a deficit anymore. Yeah. They just argue about who's going to pay it back the best way. But we have billions of dollars of debt in the country and deficits that are 10 times larger than they historically have been. Mm-hmm. And we're not, because of COVID, we're not talking about that, but I suspect we soon will be as a country, and we'll be moving back in that particular area.
Yeah, it's part of that is what makes Justin Trudeau, no matter how much he is sort of loathed in many circles, sort of untouchable, because he spent like a wild man throughout this pandemic, but what else were you going to do? You had to, right?
Every leader in every country or jurisdiction was spending like a wild man in this pandemic. It's just what had to be done in order to manage it in some way. It's now going to be interesting to watch how that all plays out in the years to come, especially with things like our taxes and stuff like that. Paul, look, it's been great chatting with you. We've gone a little over time, but I thought since it's our season finale, we should run out a little bit longer. Sure. Really enjoyed having you here and listening to your insight, and wish you just all the best in the world in your role as editor of British Columbia's oldest serving newspaper. Just quickly, it's coming up, it's the 130th year?
This is as of April 16th. 2021. The first edition of the Chilliwack Progress was April 16th, 1891.
So are there any sort of grand celebrations as you move through this year?
Well, not particularly. We did something special because coincidentally, a paper now only comes out once a week, but coincidentally it was April 16th. So we did a little bit in that edition. And then in July or June, we did a special edition. And that's where I got in touch with some former editors to write some stories for me. Four of the former editors of the Progress wrote some of their memories, and it was a pretty neat edition. You should look that up online.
Yes. Well, I hope the paper goes at least another 130 years. I hope you're not still the editor in 130 years. I think you'd probably be bored of it by then. Thanks so much again for being my guest, and that's all the time we have for this edition of Hames Hot Mic. Thanks for watching.